Okay, so thank you very much, everybody. Welcome back for the afternoon session here at the workshop. So we are going to resume with a talk by Professor Bridgette Wessel from, I hope I pronounce it correctly, from the University of Glasgow. And Bridgette is a sociologist, so she has a very interesting point of view of this type of problem. She has worked a lot on how technology can include or exclude. And so it's going to be another very interesting perspective about the ethical issues that result from the application, the use of artificial intelligence. So Bridgette will not have slides, we'll have them only at key point. Mostly she will present orally. So Bridgette, thank you very much again for joining us, and the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, and thank you very much, Monica, everybody who helped organise this workshop and conference, and also for all of you, and I hope you had a great morning. What I'm going to do is take you into, or get us to think in a slightly different way about looking at AI or ADA or RAS, robotics and autonomous systems. We'll look at some of those definitions. What I thought would be quite useful when I looked at the other presenters and the expertise that we've got is to try to think, to bring into that conversation a different way of thinking. And it could be a provocation. It's certainly not a solution, but it's kind of, let's have a look at this in a different lens. So what I'm going to talk about is developing a framework to think about, discuss and design AI-informed services, both with and for society, and that's huge. So really, as sort of by way of introduction, I kind of let AI for good. You know, what does that mean? We've got technology for good, we've got data for good. This is all this kind of discourse is flying around, and certainly, as you're all very well aware, the sort of discourse around AI, there's a lot of hype and promises. You know, it could enhance economic production. It could mean people don't have to work on boring tasks. It could make services more efficient. It might make us look at doing data better and what we collect data and what's in data. But then at the other side, there's also fears. You know, fears about privacy and security, and also the risks for different people, and the risks in, if you like, automating decision-making. And what we've really got currently in public discourse, in the media, but I think also within academia and within service providers, this rather kind of dichotomy between it's going to be amazing or it's going to be terrible. So the utopian, dystopian vision is once more with us. It stays with us. It never goes away. So, you know, how do we open that up? How do we break that up and think a tad differently? And what I thought I would use as a way to help us to do that is think about AI, and I'll talk about definitions, you know, in a few moments, as being socially shaped. If we understand technologies as, if you like, a combination of tools, a set of practices and knowledge, the way they come together and how they are socially shaped. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. And if we understand that the tools, the practices and the knowledge are social and they're shaped by us, by our different knowledges, by our different sets of expertise, how can we improve the discourse around AI in order to develop ethical AI, or the AI that we, whoever we are, want? And I think this, you know, when we look at the discourse, we kind of also have to think, are we asking the right questions? Many of us here are researchers, and we know how difficult it is and how important it is to ask the right questions. We might never get the right questions, but can we ask better questions that we're asking now? Because it almost seems as if we're stuck at a certain level and that people can't seem to get through. So can we ask better questions? So what I thought I'd do to get us thinking about that is draw on the Theuffield Foundation's report, which is now 2019, so it's sort of 2 years old, which looked at the ethical and social implications of AI, or ADA as they call it. And what I thought we'd do is take 4 of their examples. So they looked at 4 tensions where they said values are in conflict. So really it's around algorithms and is it decisions and predictions versus fair and equal treatment? Personalization versus solidarity and citizenship. The quality of services versus privacy and informational autonomy. And then convenience versus self-actualization and dignity. So by exploring, still dichotomies, but by exploring those 4 tensions through this perspective that's more from a technologist, a developer point of view, through the perspective of organizations and services, and through the perspective of ordinary people, if you like, data subjects. But they're also citizens, individuals, mum, dad, brother, sister, you know, they're actual people. So looking at those tensions from those different perspectives, and from that, think through and reflect on what Dame Wendy Hall's main concern is about diversity and inclusion. And when we look at that, then taking us forward to thinking about, do we need interdisciplinary and participatory research? If we do, what are its characteristics? Because it's very easy to say, but what do we actually mean by both of those terms in terms of the researching AI, but also developing AI in real world settings? So that's kind of, that's my take into it. The first bit of the talk is very much about framing and reframing AI and how we might look at it. Then I go into the 4 tensions. Then I reflect on what Wendy Hall's saying around AI audit, and then go beyond audit. Can we go beyond audit to actually look at how we might develop inclusive co-creation or participatory design, both in the lab, but also in the communities? And I've got 2 examples of that. So in a sense, when we're sort of asking those critical questions and stepping back from where we are, how might we frame or reframe our understanding or approaches to AI? And really what I'm asking people to think about is, can we move from abstractions to contexts? All right. So if we look at definitions, as you all know, there's a lot of woolliness around how the definitions are used. There's a lot of lack of clarity. So one of the key things is ensuring that we are clear about what we're talking about. I've certainly seen from your earlier presentations, people have talked about machine learning, AI, and so on and so forth. And really what I want to talk about here are algorithms, data, and AI, ADA, in this context. But we've also got to remember that those are, if you like, embedded or part of a wider environment, such as robotics and autonomous systems as well. So it's those relationships and particular sets of technologies. And also be very mindful about distinguishing between AI and machine learning. Often the 2 are conflated. And what are the actual differences and distinctions between those 2? And I think that's really important when we're thinking about ethical implications of AI. And what's quite interesting, even though within the lay public, within government, within organizations, and within the broader research community, people are very, very sloppy sometimes with using those definitions. But even then, when we think about the definitions, they're usually technological. You know, to get the clarity, they're clearly defined in technological terms. We also see some of those definitions being translated into policy and public language, so they're more understandable. But nonetheless, it's often about the technology. And there's also, given that, there's little specificity about data. what data, where it's derived from, the kinds of data analytic that's being done. So often the two aren't completely joined. Data's data, it's big data, 4 Vs or whatever, and it's very abstract. Same with the technological aspects, it's quite abstract. And also we see very little definition about the context of use. You know, it's going to be, we're automating a factory floor, you know, big data, or the big data analytical companies are personalizing the data for marketing and so on and so forth. But there's no real detail about the context of use. And that raises questions then about, we've got technological, we've got data, and we've got contexts of use. And in terms of context of use, does specificity matter? Is there something unique about each kind of specificity? And if so, why? What is that specificity? And how is it specific? So this is classically that notion of the universal and the specific. There are, if you like, key principles within technology design, but there's also the specific context of use, and what's that journey from that idea to the specific and back again, because it's often iterative. So I think one of the questions to help us understand AI more is, does AI feature in different ways in different kinds of context? Now, the next point that I really want to raise is knowledgeability. What is knowledge, and what is the ability, knowledgeability, if you like, a verb? And in this area, we've got human, machine, and organization. And here, it might be worthwhile thinking a little bit about distinguishing, do we distinguish between knowledge and intelligence? And what's the difference between machine intelligence, human intelligence, and organizational intelligence? And the main way this is kind of talked about is often through the notion of making moral judgments or that kind of thing, which, you know, the argument in some areas is that actually machines can't do that. But nonetheless, they can be computed to do that, and it can be coded and formulated. But that notion of knowledge, and I think here then, if we think of data, we think of information, we think of knowledge. So the distinction and the processes of working with data, turning that into information and that into knowledge. And then the next step is turning knowledge into action. So what are its outcomes? How is knowledge used? So there's something about sort of, in terms of thinking how we might want to shape and use AI or ADA, it's thinking about distinguishing what it is that we actually want and where it might fit into knowledge communities. Now, we've got this thing called knowledge communities, we've got communities of practice, but what are knowledge communities? We want data, we might want information, but how might we, if you like, configure, understand and work with knowledge, create knowledge from that? And that's not taking the tools out, it's not taking the practices out, it's bringing that together in a very, if you like, progressive, reflective and reflexive way. What, you know, how can we do that? And where does ADA and AI fit in within those new configurations? What are those new configurations? I think we've also got to remember that ADA also works with the legacy systems, and they can be technological, even, you know, it's also data. And we know that, you know, surveys and the traditional ways of collecting data have bias, that they're not complete. No data is ever complete. But there are, if you like, ways of working with data. There's ways of creating data, producing data, storing it, but also the ways in which different people within organizations work with data. Some of that is very systematic, but some of it's almost intuitive. You know, there's a sense of somebody who's probably worked in a local authority who knows the city very well, that might see something in the data that really comes from their deep knowledge of the city. We also see air traffic controllers, some of those early studies. that there might be data coming through, but they have their little sort of flip charts and notes and that sort of thing, and they'll spot something quite intuitively in that. So, you know, how is data worked with? And also ADA sort of fits in legacies of organizations, how organizations function, their culture, their structures, and so on. And there's also cultures around data, cultures around technology, and cultures around ways of working and engaging both with technology, data, and organizations. Now, one area that sort of has made some inroads into was really looking at the social life of data. So studies that have looked at the social life of data and the cultural life of data really show that data isn't something abstract. It's actually created and made through the ways in which we work. And so when we're thinking about ADA, we need to look at the cultures of the developers, the cultures of the service providers and the end users, and the way in which they're coming together, if you like, to create, in some senses, the innovation network. The innovation isn't just technological innovation, it isn't just organizational innovation, it is also social innovation. And we've certainly found in the early development of use of ICT in the homes, households were very, very adept at adapting, appropriating and shaping those ICTs to fit in with their needs. So if we think about, if you like, the social life of AI or the social life of ADA, you know, who are the actors, where are they positioned, what are their cultures and how are they coming together? And they might not be coming together in a sort of structured or organized way. It's ad hoc, it's through social process. So then that means how is ADA fitted and fixed into ecosystems? Because only till it gets fitted into that do we fully understand how it will play out in the real world and what those consequences are. And how can we see that? How can we imagine that? And of course, as these things get fitted and fixed into ecosystems, are they reproducing existing ways of doing things? Some might be positive, some might be negative. It could be reproducing bias. What are they predicting? What is the basis of their prediction? And are they predicting to reproduce, or are they predicting to be disruptive and change something? And again, this is where knowledgeability comes in. You know, in what ways do we want these tools to function? What needs to be improved? And for what? You know, what knowledge, what is it that we want to change? That links to values. And values are very much part of knowledgeability. And they're very much part of each of those actors in that ecosystem, the developers, policymakers, service providers, and also the end users. Now, often the ways in which people address the fears around technology, it's about opening the black box. And certainly that's important. And there's certainly a call to open the black box of ADA and AI. And that's really done through, as you all know, transparent. Is it transparent? And I like to word them transparent and transparency. There's a verb, there's a doing. Explainable, explainability. Interpretable, interpretability. And yes, they're really important. They're necessary, but they're not sufficient for us to truly develop ethical and inclusive AI. And I think this is where we come to the social shaping of technology. Colleagues in Edinburgh, way back in the 18s, but it's kind of resurging again now, define technology as the materiality, the practices, and the knowledge. They come together to create technology, and that's created in and through innovation networks and actors. So when we think about that social shaping, we're thinking about a process, a dynamic process. So when we're looking at developing AI for good, doing AI for good, and talking about AI for good, it's really about, can we take a process approach a dynamic approach to that, going through so we become reflective of how things are moving and how we might build that into future developments. So just bearing those sort of that framework in mind, let's just have a look at 4 of these tensions. And what I'm going to present is the kinds of questions that a developer might ask, the kinds of questions an organisation might ask, but also the perceptions and the kinds of questions a member of the public might ask. So tension 1 is really about algorithms. And what I want to look here is at the decisions and predictions versus fair and equal treatment. Now, sort of developers might ask these following sorts of questions. To what degree does accuracy trade off against different definitions of fairness? Another question they might ask, what forms of interpretability are desirable and can be ensured in state-of-the-art models? Another question might be, to what extent is it possible to ensure adequate interpretability without sacrificing accuracy or other values such as privacy? So those sorts of questions are quite well versed. People are asking those. In terms of kind of service providers, government bodies, the kinds of questions they might ask, in what sectors and applications are ADA being used to inform decisions which have implications for people's lives? Is it possible to determine how often these result in differential treatment of different socially salient groups? And thirdly, they might ask, how easy are these algorithms to interpret? What recourse do individuals have for challenging decisions? So that's their point of view. And then if we look at it from the point of view of brackets, data, the subject, the citizen, the individual, kinds of questions might be, how do individuals experience situations when major decisions about them are being taken with the aid of ADA technology? Another question they might ask are, under what circumstances are people willing to accept differential effectiveness of a technology for different groups? And then they might, what do people consider to be fair and equal treatment in different contexts? So it's all around the same theme, but there's slightly different inflections sort of coming through. If we look at the second tension of personalization versus solidarity and citizenship, the kind of questions developers might ask, are there any in principle or in practice limits to how fine-grained personalization can become using current or foreseeable technology? To what extent is personalization able to affect relevant outcomes in a meaningful way? For example, user satisfaction, consumer behavior, voting patterns. The kinds of questions an organization or a policy organization might ask, what kinds of messages, interventions and services are already being personalized using machine learning and in what sectors? They might ask, how fine-grained is this personalization and on what kinds of categories is it based? And they might ask, what evidence is there that this personalization can affect attitudes and behaviors? And then from a citizen or an individual point of view, in what context do people seek out or endorse individualized information or options specifically tailored to a certain profile they fit? Does this change? How does this change or depend on the level of personal benefit? How does it change depending on the field, e.g. health, entertainment, political advertising? And how do people experience changes in the public sphere due to automation? So again, we've got 3 slightly different angles in, but all looking at the same. Tension 3, quality and efficiency of services versus privacy and informational autonomy. The kinds of questions our developers might ask might be, by how much could machine learning and big data improve different public services? By how much? Can potential gains be quantified? What are the best current methods for securing data privacy, and what are the technical constraints? Organisations might ask, in what sectors and applications are ADI being used to improve the efficiency of public services? And they might also ask, what impacts are these specific applications having on autonomy and privacy? And our individuals, our citizens, our subjects might sort of be reflecting on, or what we need to think about is, when do people endorse the use of their personal data to make services more efficient? How do these attitudes differ depending on exactly what data is being used, who is making use of it, and for what purpose? And finally, how do these attitudes differ between groups? Because as we know, society is diverse, there's different groups. So how does that work through? And then finally, tension 4, convenience versus self-actualization and dignity. So a developer might ask, what type of tasks can feasibly be automated using current or foreseeable technologies? What would the cost be, e.g. energy, infrastructure requirements and so on, be for widespread automation of a given tasks? Our organisation people might ask, what tasks and jobs have been automated in recent years, and what might we expect to be automated in the near future? They might also ask, what effects is automation already having on people's lives? And then from the point of view of subjects, citizens and individuals, how do people experience loss of different jobs or tasks to automation? So what's that experience? And in relation to that, how are those experiences how do answers to that question differ by demographic factor? So again, that diversity. In light of increasing automation, what would people's ideal working pattern be? What might be involved in that? And then how would people like to interact with aided technologies in the workplace? Which tasks would they prefer to be taken over by these technologies, and what would they like to keep themselves? And, all of you know that debate of probably about, the more creative, the more fulfilling kinds of aspects of work could probably come forward, and the routinized, quite boring tasks can be taken away. So how do you do that? But of course, we know there's an economic factor in this. So, I haven't got time to go into that. So it's not straightforward either or. And really, there are 3 overarching questions. And I think this is more to do with public awareness, but you'll see why that's important as I come through to the research methodology in due course. Why and to what extent is it important for publics to understand a given technology? And by that I mean its mechanisms, its purposes, the owners and its creators. So how much do publics actually need to understand, particularly once ADA gets absolutely integrated and embedded within the social structures of society? If algorithms are being used as part of making decisions that impact people's lives, what kinds of explanations of its decisions are needed and appropriate? And then, although we know some of this, it works ongoing and we're getting a better sense of it, what do the public or publics see as the biggest opportunities, as well as the risks of different technologies? And how do they think about the trade-offs between opportunities and risks? And importantly, how does that differ based on their own, particular people's personal experience with different technologies? So that's about, how do you develop trust? Some people might trust the technology and they haven't got a problem. But then if that trust is broken, or their data isn't being used and they start to feel vulnerable, then actually you're kind of losing that trust. So again, trustworthiness, all of that careful thinking needs to be embedded into the design and implementation of these technologies. So what I think those debates show, and I've only sort of skimmed over them, is that from a developer point of view, a policymaker or an organizational perspective, as well as an ordinary person's point of view, people are asking questions about this stuff, okay? And they're sort of, in a funny way, they're asking it from a slightly different perspective, but there's something there there's a common bit in the middle, I think. But that common bit of the middle isn't being seen in the same way, using the same language and same level of expertise and knowledge in looking at it. And the knowledge isn't just with the AI developers, the knowledge of ordinary people. They're the ones who can understand what's happening in their everyday life. They'll see things the technologists won't see, a service provider won't see. So I think, what do we learn from these debates? And I think I've got just 4 here to help us sort of think that through as we go forward. There are different questions asked by different actors who are positioned differently in the overall network of innovation. It's social questions, technological questions, and organizational questions, yet they all point to the same thematic area and they all connect at certain points. They might not understand each other, but there's a connection. And I think when we think about those questions, context is significant in thinking through ADA. You know, it raises questions that can inform technological development. So is there something specific about health? Is there something specific about, you know, automating telehealth that's quite specific to a particular demographic, particular organizational culture, and how those technologies can be designed, and also how they're accountable, interpretable, and explainable? I mean, it's life-threatening in many ways. It also asks us to think very carefully about data and data analytics. What's the quality of that data? How are we analysing that data? And who's doing that? There are also a number of organisational factors. So the ways in which organisations both embed and turn to the technology and use it, their organisational culture, but their relationship with their service users. So beyond the organisation, so the organisation is looking both to the technology, to the data, to their culture, but also to often diverse sets of service users. And also, if you like, the context of use. So the end user, but also who are also subject to use. So what's quite specific is that the end user is also the subject as well as the end user. That data's going backwards and forward and being computed. Now, this is very complex and wide-ranging. It's huge. So how can we contextualize in any meaningful and practical way? It's easy to sort of talk about. I remember years ago when the old e-social science, you had e-science. I don't know if people remember that. Then we had e-social science, and I did a number of pilot demonstrator projects where we used some in-depth ethnographic, you know, work. And of course, that's time intensive. And I remember being at Manchester and going, this isn't practical, you know, but actually it was. We found ways of scaling up because we'd embedded that knowledge in those learning communities. And then it spun out from there. But I think what it involves doing and thinking about is how we move beyond subjects within that innovation network to actors in the overall innovation network. And that's about their knowledgeability. Whose knowledge, where they're positioned, how well they can articulate and participate in the process of socially shaping ADA. So knowledgeability also of the ordinary person. So just, you know, so moving beyond subjects to actors and knowledge. So I now just want to take us back a bit, or take us out of that sort of analytical framework, that thinking, and just reflect on what Wendy Hall's been saying. And these are just quotes from Wendy. And she says, there is not enough action on diversity. Everyone always says, yes, we need diversity. Yes, we need inclusion. But we are tired of talking about diversity because nobody knows how to fix it, right? Nobody knows how to fix it. Those of you who know Wendy, we can imagine her speaking. And then another quote from Wendy is, I can give you a whole lecture on what went wrong and what has been tried to fix it. I think we have to do it. It has to be made clear that you can't develop ethical principles without thinking about diversity. I think we have to put diversity and inclusion firmly into the ethical debate. Then she continues by saying, well, how do we do this? And she says, we need to get great minds thinking about this through means that have not yet been tried. We're all using it. We need to be part of the building of it because of the bias problems. She also then says, I think AI is too important to be left to AI experts. We've all got to be involved. I think interdisciplinary teams are the answer. I think we've got to encourage lots of people to come into AI from different backgrounds. We've got to do that now. Just, you know, I know, and she just is wonderful. She says, yes, we've got to get into the schools, but those kids in primary school won't be in the workforce for another 15 to 20 years, and then it'll be over. So what she's saying is, I'm one for going to try, I for one, am going to try and make a difference to get diversity into AI in the broadest sense at every stage of the AI process, and I need you to help. And then just as a final set of quotes from Wendy, we want students from philosophy, humanities, geography, history, English literature, that sort of background, any sort of background. And we will develop courses with the universities. There will be courses that will enable people from non-technical background to work in AI. They might have to learn about coding, but it might also be as much about training the people that are going to do the AI audits, who are going to help companies adopt AI, who are going to look at the ethical principles and work alongside the coders to get those ethical principles into the algorithms. Then she says, what does algorithm accountability and transparency mean? To take those ideas, which are very complicated and different to measure, into industry and into government. They're the translators, if you like. They're the link between what technology is doing and what society and business needs. And that's very important to me. We need to develop those people with the skills that the country needs. And in the Netherlands, they talk about interactional experts. And she argues, she thinks AI audits are the way to go. We've had decades to work on financial audits. We don't know how to do AI audits. We have to learn. A lot of research has to be done. We just don't know how to do this stuff. So yeah, in a sense, I think that ethos and the passion in that, I think, is really important. But what I'd like to do here is, can we move beyond audits to actively and collaboratively shaping ADA? And here we have got a body of knowledge to draw on. So if we draw on the knowledge gained during previous waves of digital innovations, we've saw the emergence of participatory design, human computer HCI, more recently HDI, CSCW, extreme programming, emphatic design, user-centered design. So there's a history there. There's something we can draw on and develop. We could also look at the use of PD in other settings: community design, placemaking, community regeneration, urban design. What are the lessons learned from those places? And I think here, you know, they're the leaders in some way. I mean, I worked with people in Sweden, Norway, and Denmark for quite a long time. Those Scandinavian approaches, which are PD in some particular way, but often around cooperative design that links with action research. But certainly our colleagues in Scandinavia are very aware of the limitations of PD in some ways, because the argument is that there's still closure. You might design with, and you might design for, but then nonetheless something is built and implemented and there's closure on that. And what does that mean in terms of open development, open innovation, inclusive innovation? And when we've got something such as ADA and AI that's continually evolving, it's got a long history and it's continually changing. How do we, if you like, do design in use that's ongoing, that is part of that process? So they're very, very aware of that. And of course, we've got those sort of that background, we've got something we can work with, but what are the challenges in undertaking some kind of participatory design or participatory research in ADA and in its development? And I think what's quite specific is that the visible and invisible aspects of ADA in context, it's always been an issue with the digital, what you see and what you can't see. But, you know, what is specific about that? A lot of it's about scale, you know, big data, a lot, we don't see this sort of stuff. And people imagining and trying to visualize that is very difficult. So how can you visualize ADA in context in any meaningful way? Importantly, from all perspectives. So from the citizen, the organization, as well as from the technology. So it's not just making the technology visible, it's also making an ordinary person's life visible, you know, so that the developer can understand the intricacies and what's visible in the action, but what also is invisible in somebody's actions, whether they're working in an organization or they're running a household. You know, there's things that people do that almost become invisible. I think there's also this sense of what kind of knowledgeability do we need in this particular context? And how might we recognize knowledge amongst diverse groups? So what do we need to understand in terms of ensuring we overcome bias by actually, in the first instance, being able to identify and recognize the knowledge that's important for those groups, but also important for developing ADA or AI. And so that could be people, public, private organizations, disciplines, expertise, and sectors. There's another issue of how to grow expertise now and in the future, and there's a timeliness to this. So what we're setting here is setting the, if you like, the baseline. We're quite a way in already. So how do you grow that expertise in time, in a timely manner? And then there's also, how do we improve the discourse within diversity? How do we develop a shared language and understand each other? So that notion of a language and that sharing of a language and getting joint understanding. There's also what methods. There are a number of methods that we can draw on, but do we need new methods or do we need to be creative with methods? And then finally, given the embeddedness or the way in which AI is beginning to embed into our everyday lives, into organizational life, etc., how do we create a dynamic knowledge community that engages with the process of social shaping? So if we see technology as something that is almost a citizen, digital citizenship in some kind of way, how do we do that? Now you think, oh, this is all pie in the sky stuff. It can't be done, blah, blah, blah. So what I want to do is give you an example going way back before talking about something that's just, I can't give you any details, but something that we're developing, starting to develop now here at the University of Glasgow. I'm going to go back as far as FP4. So for those of you who know the Europeans, going a long way back, late 90s. And I was involved in an EU project called Advanced Telematics for Community Help, the ATTACH project. And that was a collaboration with the London Borough of Newham, Metropolitan Police Service, and their particularly, that also include their Centre for Applied Research and Technology, BTH, a technology university in Sweden, Ericsson, Olivetti, health and social care, public sector, third sector, and universities. And I won't go into the technologies in a way, but what the project found, well, I think what its key finding was, funnily enough, wasn't so much the technological development, which was at interface and infrastructural level, but it was learning how to embed technologies within communities and how to do that as you were developing. So we did tea dancers, for example, for the elderly, that involves sort of computing, the design, the steps, the music, and people got involved with that. Children's storytelling, particularly around different migrations and different children's experience and how they did that digitally. So they didn't just sit there and learn how to use computers, they were creative with that. The development of women's cookbooks digitally. Development of citizen fora to engage in these projects. Using concierges in blocks of flats who were interested in computing and old library computers that set up youth clubs where they got involved and started learning computing. Also tower block flat digital documentaries, so they developed media companies for people living in tower blocks to undertake digital sort of documentaries. A digital museum embedded in the borough, so there's a lot of migration, so people leaving, staying, coming in, and the digitalization and placement of objects and artifacts and text around the borough that people engage with, both physically in place, but also remotely digitally. So learning those kinds of skills. And then the development of local service centres, which configured face-to-face, paper and virtual and remote in one physical space, but also could be, shared remotely. Now, that all sounds lovely, and there's all that notion of LAMRO, life after the money runs out for projects. But there was a sense of this learning and this embeddedness became institutionalized in London, because there were 4 of these that got connected London. But, I'm just going to talk about the one I know really well. And what happened was these kinds of activities became embedded in local democratic processes. So the kinds of technologies people wanted, but also how they engaged, became digital. And it was sort of reflected, it was part of that democratic process. Citizens' fora around the technologies, as well as around healthcare, policing, and so on, were part of that whole citizen fora of the local democratic process. Creative ways of engagement, highly sort of skilled and highly motivated digital education in schools and social clubs. And what this resulted in was a digital infrastructure and resources that actually could host the London Olympics. I was actually undertaking some research when they were lobbying for the London Olympics. They'd just come back from the House of Commons on their last sort of push to say, are we going to do this? And the reason the government decided to back it, and one of the reasons they were successful, they'd built up enough of an infrastructure to house the world media, which is absolutely crucial. But it wasn't just the technology that encouraged that, it was the diversity of the London Borough of Newham's residents and its young people. So the discourse it was sold on was technology, diversity, and young people. And it's still continuing. So how do we continue that journey? Technology's journey is, if you like, socially shaped anyway. It reflects society, it can reproduce its characteristics. It also has the potential to transform social life, whether positively or negatively. Then it's thinking about what is the vision for ADA and ADA for good? Whose vision is it? There is evidence of collective consensus about the benefits and risks, even though that's poorly articulated. So we've also seen from that example of many years ago that it is possible to create interdisciplinary and a participatory process. It does require creative thinking about methods, the development of partnerships, collaborative approaches with groups and communities, service provided, government and tech companies and universities. And I think just to finish, I want to talk about something that I can't really talk about in detail or name because it's all kind of happening. So how, at the moment, there is a real possibility here in Scotland of continuing those learning communities or picking that idea up in a different place, but that also has a legacy of being a learning community. And that's about the kind of research approach, its reach, and embedding research and development in social shaping. And here, we're in it's very early days at the moment, but we're currently developing a social living lab with a particular trust and estate. And that trust and estate, it's about 120 acres. It has a long history with buildings, service providers, schools, housing, residents. So it's a living community. It's part of a large town, but it also stands on its own. It's got its own infrastructure, its own roads and all the rest of it. And that trust has a long history of social and technological innovation, going way back to the 1800s. In fact, you know, look particularly in nursing and care, and often looked to develop the early nursing protocols before Florence Nightingale. So there's that kind of sense. And it's now it's now funded 5G hub. And we're talking with them. It's multi-sector. There's a range of services, a range of communities, strong community involvement, technology companies, data scientists, and all of what's being developed there as a social living lab is combining these perspectives in a series of sort of short-term, mid-term and longer-term projects, and embedding that within a particular region of Scotland. So first of all, in our social living lab, but we're completely linked into, you know, the wider region, or wider sub-region. And that ongoing engagement is where we'll come together as a innovation network to socially shape Ada. And so the technological expertise is there, but there's a real desire and understanding that we need the different approaches. We need to understand the social, the ethical, the legal, and the cultural aspects, as well as different services perspectives into that. So we can start to shape that in an open and inclusive innovation network and disseminate those. And it's really learning by doing, you know, some of it carefully managing that, but what do people, and working closely with people. So in a sense, it's resident push, community push with the possibilities. So even though it seems pie in the sky stuff, it's actually happening. So, you know, if it all goes through, no doubt Alexandra and all your participants will be coming along and coming and having a chat with you.
Yes.
Thank you very much.